Hello, hello, all you lovely people. Professor Gray here. I shaved. I look ridiculous. It's my hair. I'm not. I don't even want to move because how ridiculous my hair and every. I just. Ugh. Of course, though, if I decide to get a haircut, then I'll catch COVID and die. And so, well, yes, I'll be dead, but my hair might look fabulous. So I'm actually kind of weighing it out. No, not really. But I do have bad luck, so that's what would happen if I got a haircut. Anyway. What are we talking about? Oh, you don't even know. We're just starting the module. Yes, I'm here with the new module as we're continuing on through Unit 5 of the course. Unit 5. Oh, man, not much left here. In this unit, we're looking at deontological approaches. And now you might recall we've been talking about deontology for a bit now. So deontology, that's where there are other things with intrinsic moral value besides the goodness of outcomes. And yeah, so we're looking at these deontological theories, going to see a few. And of course, remember, these are contrasted and different from teleology or teleological theories. These are the ones that say the only thing that matters are the goodness of outcomes. Nothing else matters. And so we're seeing a pretty fundamental divergence here, a fundamental disagreement with teleology and deontology, because this represents a pretty major divide there. You can see where you can go into teleology and think about ethical egoism or different forms of consequentialism there, or instead you can go into deontology and start thinking about imposing constraints on actions. And then, of course, you have to decide if those constraints are absolute or more moderate. Now, of course, all of these debates, all of these questions are pretty important when it comes to normative ethics. More language. Normative ethics, what does that mean? Normative ethics, is about stating and defending basic moral principles. And so we are really thinking through now pretty deeply now. We've seen lots of concerns about moral principles. What ought they to be? Should our moral principles only focus on the goodness of outcomes and, be a teleology? Or should our moral principles focus on more than just the goodness of outcomes? And therefore, maybe we're starting to think about constraints and deontology. And in the previous module, we saw this pretty big distinction being made between, a concern for the greater good, which comes from that corporate conception we saw, versus concerns with the common good, which comes from that generic interests conception. And yeah, generally speaking now, not universally, but generally, the corporate conception of the greater good, the corporate conception of the greater good tends to be utilitarian in nature, tends to be. Whereas the generic interests conception of the common good tends to be deontological in nature. But I should note, these are just tendencies. These aren't absolute or, universals. It's just that doesn't always have to be the case. That is, there are some pretty sophisticated accounts of the corporate conception that might actually look somewhat deontological, with talks of constraints and things. That's kind of rare. And then similarly, it is possible, I assume, for there to be a generic interests conception that is still consequential in nature. It may not be utilitarian, but it could very well be a teleology, a consequentialist teleology. But again, going into those kind of very sophisticated theories way beyond the scope of this class. I just wanted to point that out. What I'm saying here is a kind of a general trend, but maybe that's what you guys can do. You'll figure out how to do something even better. I hope you do. But I'll just say again one more time, just that most of the time, the corporate conception of the greater good, yeah, that's utilitarian. And most of the time, the generic interests conception of the common good, that tends to be deontological in nature. And so again, the idea is that if you do actually like this generic interests conception of the common good, you might like that. I'll tell Alex you liked it if you want. But if you look at the generic interest conception says we look at some fundamental basic interests that all people share, whatever those might be. But it seems that once you start looking at fundamental basic interests that all people share, we start to seem to look pretty deontological, because those those shared basic interests are likely to influence, how you may or may not treat other people. And how you may or may not treat other people, those might start to look like constraints, on how we treat each other. We call it constraints or limitations. Constraints limit your options. They say just certain things you can't choose. Constraints take things off the table. And you might remember back when we read Robert Nozick, when he introduced this idea of constraints and deontology, he did think we had a shared interest in making plans and leading a structured life. And Nozick did think that because we have this shared interest to make plans, lead a structured life, he thought, that creates constraints. Then that's, because we all have that same interest, that does limit how we may treat each other. And so at the very, Nozick did say, at the very least, we get a constraint against aggression or a constraint against harming others. And we talked about that's still a lot of questions there, but at least this idea of constraints might be pretty attractive. And if you have the generic interests conception of a shared fundamental interest that we all have, that it might make sense that does create constraints on how we treat each other. That's why it's the generic interest conception of the common good. We're not talking about the greater good anymore. That's pretty utilitarian sounding, but we're talking about the common good, what we have in common, and how that common ground between us might limit us, create the constraints. All right. Well, now to set the topic for this module is going to be a wild ride, I think. So buckle up, Buttercup. We're in for, oh, I can't wait. Anyway, because we've been talking about constraints, and constraints limit how you can treat people. And it might seem that constraints might take the form of respecting rights. Because you might think that if you the viewer, who I hope are watching this, if you believe you have rights, that you probably also believe that right you have will create constraints on how other people, may treat you, like how I, Professor Gray, treat you. So for instance, I'll flip it around. Usually it's me, but I'll tell you now have the right to your property. I believe you believe that about you have a right to your property. And that does then mean that maybe I, Professor Gray, have a constraint now on my actions because I'm forbidden at the very least to steal your property from you, right? I think that we don't have to agree. That seems pretty obvious. And so what we see here is that rights, if they do set up these constraints, which seems like they do, then rights are clearly a fundamental or really important part of, deontology. Because in other words, it seems that your rights create constraints on me. And because there's constraints on me now, we seem to be, because constraints are a part of deontology, a pretty normal part. Because again, if we care about more than just the goodness of outcomes, there's going to be limits and things on how we may treat each other. And those are the constraints. And so this is why then I want to talk about rights now in this unit on deontological approaches, because most deontological approaches at some point will introduce rights, especially if we start talking about generic interests, common good. Rights seem to be a pretty natural thing that's going to come up. And I will say also there's a second reason that I want to talk more and have a whole module on rights here. It's because rights are surprisingly tricky. And that's why I said this is going to be a wild ride, because maybe for some of you, rights seem a very natural, thing to talk about, makes sense. But when we talk about your right to property or your right to life, I think we all have a general sense of what's going on, what's expected, what that means. However, let's look at Article 26 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Wow, it's a mouthful. Yeah, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you look at Article 26 says that everyone has the right to education. And look, maybe, hey, we all nod our heads and be like, yeah, that makes sense. Everyone has a right to education. But the philosopher, it's always the philosopher who comes right and ruins the party. Because the philosopher will look at that and say, everyone has a right to education. The philosopher asks, well, who is everyone? Everyone on the planet? Or just everyone in one of the nations that signed this Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Because I'll just tell you, you can look this up. This is a fact. Saudi Arabia, for instance, has not signed that Declaration of Universal Human Rights. Saudi Arabia is not a signatory nation on it. Most nations are, but Saudi is one that is not. And so we might then ask, well, look, who's supposed to, so do the Saudi citizens not count because Saudi Arabia didn't do it? And so we have to think about that. Does everyone count, or is it only the people who signed? We have to think about that. And then we might also ask, the philosopher will say, once you figure that out, the philosopher says, come back to me. And now the philosopher will ask, well, okay, given this is a right and you've told me who everyone is, how do we, or who respects it, and how are they supposed to respect this right? Who's got the responsibility? So suppose someone in Saudi Arabia, suppose there's a young woman in Saudi Arabia who does not have an education that she would like to have. Am I, Professor Gray, responsible in some way for helping her get an education? I guess I can teach. Do I have to go fly over there and teach them? Or should I send money to some organization that then will sponsor her to get an education? Is it my responsibility, or is this more like the Saudi government's responsibility to educate, one of its citizens, and not Professor Gray's job to do that? But then we'd say, but Saudi didn't sign that declaration, so why would they be more responsible than me, say? Because at least I am, Professor Gray is, I hate talking about myself as like, Professor Gray says, I say, I'm a citizen of the United States. The United States did sign that declaration. So does that mean because America signed it, that Americans are now responsible for the education of people in countries who did not sign that? So that's some interesting questions already emerging here. And suppose we settle that, and the philosopher should say, okay, suppose you've decided that you think it is the government's job, and it's the Saudi government's job to educate its own darn citizens, and it's not Professor Gray's job to do that. And so then the philosopher would say, well, suppose if Saudi Arabia refused, said, no, we're not going to educate this person. Sorry. Now what? Is someone supposed to step in and make Saudi Arabia do this? Is someone supposed to step in and exert maybe pressure of some kind through trade? I don't know. Is there supposed to be pressure then on Saudi to educate all of its people? And who's that? Is that America, or is that the United Nations? Whose job is to do that? And what can they do to, enforce these rights? And so, okay, that's just a quick run through there. I think you're getting the idea now that, we can look at a right, and it gets kind of complicated surprisingly quickly about, who has the right, who's supposed to help with the right, and if that person lets them down, who else has to step in, or does no one? I told you we're gonna go in a lot of detail, but that's just like the beginning of the bumpy ride. That's like the first little drop on the roller coaster. Don't worry, it's gonna get much more spicy for sure. And so, we're going to go through this and wade into deeper and deeper and choppier water when it comes to rights in this module. So the first thing we'll do in this module is we'll look at the nature of rights a bit. And then second, we'll try to make sense of all these ambiguities with rights that I've already started to kind of tease out. And third and finally, I'll present even more questions about rights. We'll get, I think, 6 more questions. There's too many, but that's the module. There it is. There's all the stuff the agenda we'll be covering in this. And I should just say, before we dive in any further, is that this module is certainly going to have way more questions than answers. You are going to walk away, I think, with lots of confusion and questions yourself that I'm not going to settle, because people disagree about the nature of rights all over the place. I'm just going to give you kind of a guide through this roller coaster ride. And at the end, you'll get off and you'll either vomit in a bucket or you'll want to get back on and figure it out. I hope it's the second, but I know the first time I did this, I was like, oh my gosh, there's human rights. I thought they made sense. But either way, it'll be a fun ride. But yeah, a few people will agree on this stuff. So there's a lot of ambiguity. And sometimes you just got to be comfortable with ambiguity in the sense that people disagree. And sometimes there's just not an obvious right answer. And I won't pretend to give you one, because it's whatever I would say, half of you would disagree with, I think, for sure. So I just want you to see the confusion, and then you can work on yourself, think where you land on that. So that's just a heads up. But before we dive into that roller coaster ride through rights, well, hey, why don't we take our first quick break, and then I'll see you back here in a moment.